Namaskar and welcome to this special presentation. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. It matters to a rising power like India to know how the world looks at it. At various intervals, different global surveys are released. A good rank makes one feel proud. One seeks to better it. When gap areas are pointed out, it gives a direction to our priorities. But what if India is pushed to poorer ranks within agenda? In areas like democracy, civil liberties and press freedom, indices that are not based on objective data but on perception and opinions of a few. What dangers do such problematic indices pose to India? Some of these indices and rankings I'm referring to are, for example, by Economist Intelligence Unit, that's EIU, which is the research and consulting arm of the firm that publishes the Economist magazine. Another one, WeDem rankings produced by Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden. Another example would be Freedom House, which is a Washington-based think tank that is primarily funded by the US government. Now, to talk about this issue, let's connect with two eminent guests who have engaged with this theme closely. Let me welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India, and Professor Salvatore Babones from University of Sydney, Australia. Professor Babones is a sociologist whose research focuses on the political economy of the Indo-Pacific region. A warm welcome to this program, and thank you very much for joining us from across different time zones in particular. Now, in the course of this conversation, I will refer to some important pieces of writing by you, particularly Mr. Sanyal. You've co-authored a paper titled Why India Does Poorly on Global Perception Indices, and Professor Babones has written an article on Indian democracy at 75. Who are the barbarians at the gate? These writings are available on public domain, so if you, the viewers, want to take a closer look, you can access them by yourself. Let me begin with you, Mr. Sanyal. You're an economist. You must come across diverse kinds of data, indices and reports all the time. What bothers you about these recent reports that have come in that present India in such poor rankings across categories such as democracy, civil liberties and press freedom?
Well, there is clearly an issue here. But, I'm an economist, as you mentioned, and I usually deal with much more hard economic data. But I discovered that there were all these perception and opinion-based indices on all kinds of subjective topics like academic freedom and happiness and so on. And many of these indices for years we ignored, till I discovered that in fact they find their way indirect into all kinds of things that are concrete. For example, the three indices and think tanks that you mentioned, they find their way into the World Bank's World Governance Index, which in turn impacts sovereign ratings. In fact, 18 to 20% of sovereign ratings are based on an amalgamation of many of these indices. Therefore, we cannot any longer ignore these things. In fact, if anything, with these new ESG requirements, these kinds of subjective indices will become even more important. So this is why I'm taking it on. Now, look at the sheer absurdity of some of these indices. The WeDem has just come up with an index on academic freedom. Now, in there, it places India in the bottom 20 to 10 decile. Now, who are the people in that decile? They're countries like Yemen, for example, which is a war-torn country. But even more absurd, two deciles up, they have put Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, I'm afraid, is difficult to categorize as having more academic freedom by, a couple of notches than India. I mean, clearly there is an agenda-driven dynamic that is working out. Similarly, happiness index. I mean, first of all, as Vivek Devroy has pointed out, happiness is a state of mind. Putting numbers to it is a difficult thing. But even if you did do it, surely you will begin to have some doubts in your mind when, for example, India turns up in the bottom 10, just about above Afghanistan and below Yemen and many other countries. You have the same thing with the democracy as well. sheer absurdity of having, for example, a country like a territory, it's not even a country, like Northern Cyprus being placed above India in democracy. I mean, come on, it's not even a proper country. It's not recognized by any country other than Turkey. And here is a country that has actually ethnically cleansed its entire Greek population. Such a country is actually placed as being, more democratic than India. Clearly, there is some big question marks on all these indices, and it's about time we begin to question them.
Now, Professor Babones, as someone who's observing developments in India from the outside, how do you see these reports creating a perception about India in the world? Because in your writing, you do mention that these flawed indices are quite detrimental to various aspects of India's engagement with the world, especially foreign affairs.
Sanjeev is right, but he's not right enough. If he's looking at the world through a strictly economic lens, of course, you can focus on the problem of how these enter into hard metrics like bond ratings, but they also enter more subtly into softer metrics. So, for example, the Quad Security Alliance has been effectively downgraded in the last 2 years. Now, has that been because India is not being perceived as a fellow democracy in the Indo-Pacific? I can't say for sure. No one can say for sure. And it's not just the Quad. There are all sorts of cooperation that we expect to have among democratic countries. So to the extent that India is no longer being perceived as a democracy, and I can tell you, in elite circles outside India, India is no longer perceived as a democracy by many influential policymakers. Well, if that's the case, then India is going to face all sorts of difficulties with the rest of the world that aren't limited strictly to paying more money for government bonds, as bad and as measurable as that may be. But there are many intangibles that it's hard to ponder, but we know they're there.
Right. Professor Babones, according to the EIU rankings, downfall of India's democracy, as per these reports, appear to begin with Prime Minister Narendra Modi taking office in 2014. From rank 27, India falls down to rank 46. Then there is a report by Varieties of Democracies Institute that puts India at 101 position. It's closer to nations like Myanmar and Papua New Guinea. How do you evaluate these assessments?
Oh, even more striking is India being put on a level with Myanmar, and that's post-coup Myanmar, not pre-coup Myanmar. Look, a lot of this simply has to do with the fact that the people answering these surveys find the current government of India very distasteful. Now, they have a right to do so, but they shouldn't be allowing that to influence their appraisal of Indian democracy. Now, Sanjeev in his work has pointed out the biases in the rankings, and he's not wrong about those biases. But the biases were there in 2010 when India was ranked 54th in the world for electoral democracy by the VDEM Institute. Today, India is ranked 100th in the world, or 101st in the world for the same metric, using the same measures. So if it's a bias, the bias would be there all along. It wouldn't be increasing in the last decade, the last 10 or 11 years. Now, VDEM in particular, we have data going back. So the expert panel used by VDEM has used the same metrics that VDEM uses to measure electoral democracy today to measure electoral democracy in past years. That panel rates India in 1976 at the height of the emergency, in a year in which elections had been suspended. They ranked India 33rd in the world for democracy. Now, and it's not just because there were fewer democracies then. So India's quantitative score for 1976 was 0.508. The quantitative score today is 0.444, which is substantial, about 10% lower than it was at the height of the emergency. Now, this requires a reality check. We have to ask ourselves, the people who are filling out the surveys for the Variety of Democracies Institute, how grounded in reality are they if they think that the India of the midst of Indira Gandhi's emergency was a higher quality, and I stress, a higher quality electoral democracy, not a social democracy or a higher quality electoral democracy than the India of 2021?
Now, I want to spend some time on this theme in particular. Mr. Sanyal, is India singularly targeted in these global indices? Why is that? India's present state of civil liberties, as Professor Babones just mentioned, is compared to the times of the emergency. And despite glaring conflicts in say countries like Hong Kong, Sri Lanka, they appear to be ranking better than India. How do you make sense out of it?
I mean, one has to be come to the conclusion that there are serious biases in this. Now, I totally agree with Salvatore that some part of it is that the inputs that go into it come from a elite a particular segment of the intellectual elite that provides biased inputs. And he is right that the framework has not changed, and why should we go down? So yes, given the framework, India's trajectory has gone down, and that recent decline, I agree, is due to the fact that these inputs that are coming from this extremely limited group of people. By the way, very often there are no more than 3 to 6 experts who are being consulted. So it's not like it's a survey of 3 to 6 people. So you can imagine what it is. But I wouldn't let off the think tanks. I wouldn't let the think tanks off the hook for 2 reasons. First of all, they do apply their mind to choose those experts. So it's not as if they are not exercising some decisions here. The second point is, I do think that the indices themselves do need to be even if they haven't changed so much. I mean, there are serious biases in them. I'll give you one example. There is a sub-index which the VDEM uses, which is on direct democracy. Now, I understand that that direct democracy index may make sense for Switzerland. How do you expect in a country the size of India to be run based on regular referendums? Obviously, you can't do that. And of course, what happens is that India ends up scoring 0 on that on that particular sub-index. Incidentally, US
context
also
of evaluation
up,
itself is problematic, it seems.
Absolutely. So, and then you have a situation where countries like Afghanistan, Cuba, for example, actually do better. They score something more than 0 on those indices. So, there is something clearly strange about it. Similarly, what about the questions that are not asked? So, I'll give you an illustration. If you're doing a democracy index, surely one matrix you must ask, an obvious question you must ask is the head of state elected? Now, surely that's a part of your democracy. Now, if you did that, it would tell all those high-scoring constitutional monarchies from the Nordic countries, the United Kingdom, the Benelux countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all of them are constitutional monarchies. Now, they would end up getting 0 in that score. So it's not just the questions that are asked, but also the questions that are not asked.
With apologies, though, I think Sanjeev is, I'm sorry, I think Sanjeev is being a little bit, forgive me, Sanjeev, a little bit deceptive here. I mean, we all know that the King of England may be an unelected head of state, but the King of England has no power in England. So this is a vestige of the past. And we're all aware that in these countries that are highly ranked democracies, the heads of states are pure figureheads who literally, the elected government writes the speech that the King of England will give in Parliament. So I really would try to push back against being distracted by these sorts of facts. Yes, they're shocking. Yes, we can say that Sweden is in some theoretical sense a theocracy because the king must be Lutheran. But in practical terms, the fact is nobody was arguing about India's ranking on these democracy indices 10 years ago. Why was nobody arguing about it? Because, okay, we could quibble over these little things, but fundamentally, the rankings were reasonable. Is India really the 20th or 30th best democracy in the world? Yeah, probably it is. I mean, is it as good as New Zealand? I don't know, but that's a legitimate debate we could have. The illegitimate debate is not over these structural biases in the rankings. The illegitimate debate comes in because we see India ranked on a level with a military junta in Myanmar. Well, that's the fundamental problem we're facing here, not the biases, but the actual data going into them.
Okay, Professor Babones, I take that point. What Mr. Sanyal also mentioned is the manner in which a group of few experts are responsible for generating, manufacturing these perceptions against India. Now, if I refer to your writing, you're also presenting a rhetorical question. It reads, who are the barbarians threatening India's democracy? Is it the government of India who's not doing the job properly? Or are there these group of experts, you refer to them as intellectuals? Now, who are these experts according to you? And what do they have to gain in sort of such acts of misrepresentations against India?
Well, first, Sanjeev makes a very good point that the most important bias in these rankings is who is chosen to do the ranking. That is, who is chosen to actually answer the survey. It's only half dozen people, as Sanjeev said, for every country. We don't know the exact numbers for India. The barbarians at the gate analogy was an analogy I made because we so often hear in the West how the current government of India is barbarizing Indian democracy. And when I actually looked at the information, looked at the data, no, in fact, the accounts that we are being fed through the rankings authorities are not consistent with the overall message they're trying to communicate. That is, what I see are misrepresentations, misuse of statistics, in some cases outright lies in the democracy rankings, in the qualitative accounts given to support the quantitative rankings. So, that's a serious problem. It's also very interesting that although India's ranking has declined on all three of the major democracy rankings, it is ironically the most expert-driven of the ranking. There's a survey-driven ranking, that is VDEM, which is actually based on a survey of in-country intellectuals that has given the worst result, whereas The Economist, which is based on its own internal evaluation, has given, relatively speaking, the best result. And the one that uses a mix of methods, the Freedom House rankings, have given a medium result, which is to say that those methods that are most reliant on asking people inside the country, what do you think of Indian democracy? Those are the ones on which India performs worst. Now, what do I mean by an intellectual? I don't want to quibble over this word intellectual. People who are paid, people who have official positions in established institutions. A JNU professor of politics is an established intellectual to rank democracy. A popular book author, no matter how popular, is not an established intellectual, is not a credentialed intellectual. People who hold positions in which you would expect an international authority to go to them. President of the Indian Sociological Association, president of the Indian Political Science Association, deans of politics at the top, at JNU, the head of the newspaper guild. These are the sorts of people we would expect to be surveyed in a ranking, and anyone would expect those people to be surveyed. I don't know who's in the surveys, but these are the sorts of people we mean when we say India's intellectual class have ranked India poorly on the rankings.
I think that's an important problem that you've highlighted. We do not know who these experts are. And Mr. Sanyal, you've also stressed on this aspect in your writing. A common thread in all these indices is that they seem to be derived from perceptions, opinions of few experts. We do not know who these experts are. That also puts to question the sheer credibility of such reports and indices.
So I think one is that we just stink about it in the media or in writing papers, but I think there are, and here I agree with Salvatore that there is a wider perception problem, but I have my role is a more narrow one, so I'm going to take a more narrow view of this as far as solutions is concerned. First of all, many of these indices are given legitimacy by the fact that they are used by international organizations like the World Bank for things like the World Governance Index. So I think at the very least, the World Bank has got to go and ask them for much more transparency and ask them how they're going about doing it, because the results are quite apparent. And if you're giving them legitimacy, then your own legitimacy is being affected. So I think international organizations like the World Bank, like the UN, in many cases, the UN is giving them legitimacy. So we and the government of India needs to stand there and ask questions of the World Bank and the UN about what is the transparency, the accountability of the various inputs that they use for their own indices. So this has got to be one important step. Second, I think this is, while this may be a particularly obvious problem for India, this is a more general problem that will happen going forward as it will grow. As I said, the ESG issue is growing and it will become an issue. But this point is, there has to be a conversation about the fact that there are an extremely small number of Western think tanks that dominate this entire conversation. Now, there has got to be a discussion about equity on as well. And I think, why shouldn't there be more Indian think tanks or independent Indonesian think tanks or other agencies, a more variety of agencies who need to be included in the conversation? Otherwise, this is, in my view, a new form of colonization.
Now, a little more on this idea of a new form of colonization. I'm referring to your writing where you talk about misrepresentation of context. Now, Economic Intelligence Unit, or EIU report, equates the pandemic lockdown with the idea of political lockdown, and then it sort of evaluates in that period the manner in which civil liberties were compromised. Now, that's hugely problematic because pandemic has been a global challenge, and the measures that India put in place were not very different from what was being done around the world.
Absolutely. So this is totally the case, and this sort of misrepresentation, interestingly, also filters through to the more hard, supposedly data-driven indices. So while this discussion is about the perception-based indices, let me show you how this is also there in, say, the Human Development Index, which I've written about as well. And there you have a peculiar situation that the number of deaths caused by COVID have been used to reduce India's expected life expectancy. Now, this is a completely ridiculous thing at multiple levels. First of all, COVID does not impact young children. Nobody below 20 really dies from COVID. So unless you're making the case that 20 years from now, a child born today will be affected by COVID, you can't begin to mess around with the life expectancy numbers. Secondly, it is based on entirely a model-driven numbers which have been derived, not based on actual statistics. So India has, got this massive reduction in its life expectancy based on a model, which has been, by the way, disputed right from the day go, and been given this cut in its HDI index. As I said, I don't want to get into the details of it because it's a discussion in its own right, but I'm just telling you that there is a systematic problem, and it's about time that we begin to question all of these things. And for way too long, we have, one is, of course, the inputs, and Salvatore is right, but I think there is a question of going out there and looking at the methodologies and questioning them as well.
Right, those are some very important takeaways. Mr. Sanyal, given the magnitude of the challenge posed by these biased indices and tackling this challenge, how does the government of India look at this problem, this challenge in particular, and what are the options ahead to tackle this problem?
Well, I can't speak for the government of India. I can speak for myself. What I can say is that, first of all, for far too long, we have just ignored this matter or just complained about it privately and taken it on the chin, so to speak. But I do think that we need to be much more conscious of this, look into the matter, push back, for example, when organizations that we are members of, like the UN and the World Bank, use these indices. I think there is a case for doing that. As I said, there is a case also for, independent Indian or organizations to begin doing that. We need, not today, but for the longer run, in order to create a more balance in the global conversation, we do need to be turning our gaze the other way. And that requires being willing to allow Indian organizations to do that. True, this may not initially have too much benefit. Maybe the same bunch of people will be giving the data and so on. Over a period of time, we'll build the capacity to do it ourselves and ask the questions in our own way. I give you, as I said, there are questions that the types of questions that are asked or not asked make a big difference. So if we are the ones asking the questions, then we can have that conversation. Just to give you an example, when there were protests in Canada last year, they were put down with absolute brutality. in ways that if it had happened in Indonesia or India or South Africa, they would have been taken in a completely different way. I think even if, as Salvatore says, the initial first round does not generate a different result, even then it is worthwhile to put in the effort to create the capacity to be able to turn the gaze. So I think those are the 2 or 3 things. There are a long list that we can discuss, but and some of them there in my paper. But I do think that we need to take this much more seriously than we have in the past.
Right. And Professor Babones, I'll come to you for the final comments. What Mr. Sanyal says becomes all the more important as India takes over the presidency of the G20, shapes in many ways global affairs and agendas. How significant does checking these agenda-based indices and reports become in such a context?
Oh, I think it is very important for India, but I think the way to check them is to go to the data, to present not a counter argument, but a counter set of data. Show that the data on which the rankings are based are flatly wrong. And to remember that people aren't going to accept a politicized response. Everyone expects the government of India to be representing India and to say positive things about India. What's needed to change the overall narrative is to get facts in the public domain. I'm personally convinced that the facts are in India's favor here. I'm not defending India. I have no interest, from an emotional standpoint, I have no interest in India. It's purely an intellectual exercise for me. But what's led me to defending India's reputation in these rankings is that the facts are in favor of India, not that my loyalties are to India. And that should always be remembered. If you argue based on the facts, I think you have a winning case.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Salvatore Babones and Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, for joining us in this discussion and sharing your perspective.
Thank you.
So that was a special presentation where we discussed the issue of biased global indices that push India to poorer ranks, indices that are not based on objective data, but on perception and opinions of a few. I'll take your leave for now. News and updates continue on DD India after a short break. Namaskar.